This is Barrie, a city constantly evolving. At any time, a whole host of pressures challenge the intricate tapestry of city government. In this series, we will explore the priorities deemed essential for progress, even if they don't always inspire unanimous applause. Join me each week for a candid conversation with a member of our city government, as we uncover the stories behind the scenes of Barrie, a city on the move. Welcome to Barrie, City on the Move. I'm your host, Arif Khan, and it's my pleasure to join you wherever you're receiving this content, whether it's online, on cable, on YouTube. I'm just so glad to be able to share this time with you. In this series, we aim to explore the relationship of city governance, city operations, and including relationships with partner organizations that might fall outside of the city proper. All for the goal of ensuring that we deliver a quality of life for our residents in the city of Barrie and surrounding area for that matter. My guest today is one of those partners, and he's no stranger to the city of Barrie. He sat as a multi-term councillor of the city of Barrie starting in 2006 until election as the federal member of parliament for Barrie South and Innisfil. It's John Brassard. Thanks for making time to join me on Barrie City on the Move today. Welcome. My pleasure. When you say it like that, it's hard to believe. It's been 18 and a half years that I've been representing the community. It's been a long time. And you've through that time, I mean, and I'm going to throw this completely unscripted tag out there, a career and a life of service that started as a first responder. You served a number of years as a firefighter until you sort of got the itch and the bug to sort of expand and beyond that into public service at a federal level. Yeah, it was kind of interesting because 30 and a half years as a firefighter, started my political career well before that, because I was president of the Firefighters Association as president. So I was advocating on behalf of firefighters and their families at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. And that's really where my interest in politics started peaking. And then in 2006, decided to run for Barrie City Council in Ward 7, got elected again in 10, 14, and then when Patrick Brown, who announced that he was running as the leader of the provincial party, decided he was going to step up, that's when I stepped in and ran federally and got elected in 2015. 18 years. Hard to believe. 18 and a half. 18 and a half. It all matters. Yeah. I'll thank you in advance for those years of service, obviously. I really wanted to discuss with you and get in to some conversation with you today about the nature of the relationship and the dynamic, and I think no better a place to start with that 2 years ago, this term of local governance, there was a call that came to your office, an invitation that came to you to join local city officials and politicians in particular, along with your partner in Barrie North and Springwater Oro-Medonte, Doug Shipley, as well as your provincial counterparts, Andrea Kenjan and Doug Downey, to come and have a strategic planning session at the City of Barrie to start off this most recent term. Had that call come to you before, and what was the experience like, and really what came out of it is really what I want to know. Well, since I've been elected since 2015, I've always had a good working relationship with the City of Barrie and the town of Innisfil. The thing you got to remember, Doug also was a city councillor. He was elected first in 2010, and so, having that experience, both of us as being former city councillors, has really helped out in terms of our federal role. But in 2000, and it was around this time actually, 2 years ago, that Mayor Nuttall reached out to, as you said, the federal and provincial members of legislatures and asked us to come in and be part of the strategic planning session. And so we went in on a Saturday. We learned about the city's priorities, which were critical, and they're now, in midterm of implementing. But the discussion really turned around how we can help, right, at the federal level and at the provincial level, and that's where the conversation went that day. Yeah, and out of that, a term was coined, and I believe they referred to it. Team Barrie. Team Barrie. They still referred to it, and I believe you still refer to it as well. What was something that you found interesting about that relationship that maybe hadn't been explored before, or an opportunity through creating a Team Barrie approach? I hear you when you say you've always had a great relationship, and I understand that. However, we've previously, and certainly until now, even today, we talk about silos, and we talk about different levels of government having different areas of responsibilities, and there's truth to it. There are services and responsibilities that municipalities take responsibility for versus federal and provincial.
Yep.
But this whole idea of a Team Barrie approach, did that make sense, and if so, why?
Well, it does, because ultimately our responsibility as elected representatives and leaders in our community is to represent our constituents to the best of our capability, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal. One of the things that I noticed in that strategic session was just, bringing everybody together for the betterment of Barrie. Obviously, council's got some bold ambition through their strategic priorities, which is being led by Mayor Nuttall. But really being a part of that was critical for us to better understand what those priorities were and how we can help. For example, housing is a critical issue in the city of Barrie, housing affordability, housing attainability. What is it that we can do at a federal level to help that? What could Andrea and Doug do at a provincial level to help in that regard? Infrastructure, obviously another big part of a growing city. And so, look, Doug and I are somewhat limited, frankly, in our ability, because we're not part of the government, we're part of opposition. But that doesn't limit our ability to advocate on behalf of the city of Barrie. I know Doug and I have, in many cases, advocated and requested what the city has requested of the federal government, whether it's on issues of housing, whether it's issues of infrastructure. Lake Simcoe is another big part of this area, what it represents in terms of the economics of our region. So we've been advocating on behalf of not just council, for some of their requests of the federal government, but we've also been advocating on behalf of the people we represent as well.
And I'm glad you brought that up, and if you hadn't, I was probably going to ask you about that. I mean, there is an interesting dynamic of being in opposition. Mm-hmm. However, you still bring that message to and from Ottawa, and you do have some strategic relationships with members of sitting government, et cetera. There is and let's actually tangent just for a moment. There is the perception that we do see on television and that we do read in the newspaper, and quite possibly some of it's true. But when the cameras aren't rolling, opportunity for collaboration, opportunity for constructive progress and dialogue to happen. Does that happen?
All the time. All the time. We're in a highly charged political environment at the federal level. I mean, people who watch federal politics understand just how charged it is. But at the end of the day, it's the relationships that we build, whether we are in opposition or whether we're in government, that becomes critical in advocating for the people that we represent. And I'll give you some examples. The federal government has announced housing programs that both Doug and I have supported. Whether it was Redwood Park Properties, whether it's been through the Rapid Housing Initiative. If the federal government has money that the city of Barrie can utilize to help the people that we represent or the businesses, then we advocate on that part. I look back over COVID and all of the measures that were put into place. I can't begin to tell you how many times I spoke to ministers and parliamentary secretaries about supporting, not just during COVID, but beyond that. Recently, I've had discussions with Minister Bill Blair, the Minister of Defense, about housing at Base Borden, because housing within our military is just as critical a problem as it is within our municipality. So that collaboration happens. Obviously, if you're in government, you hold the levers of power, decisions can be made easier. But the job of a federal representative in opposition is to support and advocate its community, and that's precisely the approach that I've taken in these 9.5 years of being in opposition, because I have been in opposition for 9.5 years, and we've seen some success within the city of Barrie. We've also seen some things that I would like to see initiated, like the reinstatement of the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan. That hasn't happened despite promises of the federal government, but we continue to advocate. But more so, as we get to an election, which I expect will be coming soon, many of those policies that we've been advocating for, we push to be part of our platform as well. For example, Lake Simcoe, I know in 2021 it was part of our platform. We're going to push to have it in our platform for 2025, and I expect that it'll be there, for example.
It's fascinating how this can, transition into that conversation, and I do want to pick that conversation up with you a little bit later in one of the upcoming segments. Let's talk about that, though. You mentioned that your role in government, your role as the member of the opposition, is to advocate for. Talk to me about checks and balances when it comes to a democratic society. There is also the opportunity for that as a member of the opposition, and I imagine in one day, should you be in government, you'll have somebody else holding you to account in form of checks and balances.
Sure. Yeah, and that's really the primary role of the opposition. Its constitutional obligation is to oppose the government in many ways, to litigate, to prosecute the government, whether it's issues of economic policy or domestic policy, foreign policy, all of the things that happen within Parliament. That's the job of the opposition. So we've been doing our job effectively, prosecuting the government. But I look at my role, and I've had some pretty substantive roles at the federal level. I was opposition House Leader under Candace. I'm currently chair of the Ethics Committee. I was also part of the leadership team for a period of 4 years under former leader Andrew Scheer. So I've had those roles. But ultimately what my role is to represent the constituents in Barrie, Innisfil, right?
So let me ask you about that, because you ran under a certain banner. You are a conservative. It's how you would probably cast your vote, I'm guessing, is a good way of saying it.
No, I'm going to vote for myself, Arif, yes.
Yeah, but when you are sitting in Ottawa, or talk about the difference, I guess, between sitting in Ottawa and the work that your office does.
All politics are local. It doesn't matter who voted for me, whether you're conservative. Obviously, I'm not naive to think that I'm going to get everybody's vote. I understand that there are people that think Liberal, think NDP. My job at the end of the day, and the job of my staff and my constituency office, is to represent the people of Barrie, Innisfil in the best way that I can. I tell my staff, our job is to not simply satisfy the people we represent. Our job is to amaze them. And so whether they're dealing with CRA issues, immigration issues, CPP, OAS, we deal with them in the same manner, deal with everybody in the same manner as I would with my mom and dad, for example, right? And my staff are amazing. There's not a day that goes by where I'm not in the community and somebody says, thanks to Susan, thanks to Sarah in your office, I was able to resolve my CRA issue or resolve my immigration issue. That, to me, gives me the greatest joy. You got to remember, I'm in Ottawa 31 weeks a year. So the eyes and ears on the ground in Barrie, Innisfil are my staff, and when people walk into my office, they know, regardless of who they voted for, that they're going to get the same level of service that they would expect if their member of Parliament was in the government or whether he was in opposition or not. So that's what we do.
John Brassard, Member of Parliament for Barrie, Innisfil, member of the opposition and mind reader. When we come back from this break, I do want to talk to you about localizing that message. You spent 31 weeks in Ottawa, a smaller balance or a smaller proportion locally, and I want to talk to you about how you maintain that relationship with the local constituents. So stay with us for more from John Brassard on Barrie City on the Move. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move. I'm having a great conversation with John Brassard, who is the Member of Parliament for Barrie South and Innisfil, and so glad that you're here. We're talking about life, certainly in terms of collaboration, the relationship, the dynamic of the relationship between the local and the federal government. And you mentioned just before we went to the break, you spend 31 weeks in Ottawa on average or typically, and your staff certainly carries a lot of the weight and the load and being the face of your office. Talk to me about how you find that balance and the opportunity to stay connected with what's important, essentially, to the people that you serve. Our lives are here. We care about what's going on here.
Well, one of the most important things that I've learned, even through my municipal time, is that you've got to return people's phone calls, you've got to return their emails, you've got to stand at the end of the driveway or even sometimes sit at their kitchen table. And it's a strategy that I still employ as a member of parliament. People are surprised when they get a call from me, for example. Now, obviously, I don't call everybody because I'm not doing casework like Sarah in my office is doing. But, when there are issues of a political nature that people require a call back, I give them a call back, right? And you can hear the surprise at the end of the phone line when you identify yourself as the member of parliament. But, that's one way of staying connected, obviously, and it's an important way. The other part is being part of the community. When I'm back, I spend a lot of time in the community, going to various events. People approach me. Obviously, I utilize the time when I'm back in the office to have meetings. My staff will generally stack them up, one over the other. People come in and talk about their issues, and that's how I can express myself when I get back to Ottawa, so that I know that when I stand up in the House of Commons, that I'm representing the views of my constituents, not just those who vote Conservative, but other constituents who may have voted for a different party, for example. It's important to stay connected in that way. And those events that I go to, a lot of people come up to me, they tell me their stories. I often get asked, why do you go to so many events? Well, not just to stay connected, but I have a platform, Arif, that a lot of people don't have. And so if I can use that platform in a positive way within the community, identify, for example, Women and Children's Shelter event, I go there. If I can use my platform to amplify their message, if one person seeks help, one person volunteers, or one person donates, or another person who doesn't realize that this type of service exists in our community because of the platform, then that's using that platform in a positive way, and that's what I try to do.
Excellent. So with that in mind, again, we're the show is around Barrie in particular, and that relationship with the different service providers. You're bringing that message. You're advocating. You've stated earlier that you've got a good, constructive relationship with members who might be in government, ministers, et cetera, to whether it's on immigration issues, et cetera.
Yeah.
We've gone through a pretty tough period in the last number of years, whether it was ridiculous inflation, high interest rates, people caught off guard buying a home at 1%, and next thing you know, they're at 7%, and they can't manage to keep their home at renewal time, something along those lines. Some of it we could say was related to the pandemic, other we could say was economic policy, et cetera. The statistics suggest that 77% of people are struggling, whether it's with the paycheck, to meet their obligations, record household debt, et cetera. How does a federal member of parliament bring that message representing the struggles or the challenges that local citizens and business owners in Barrie are addressing and facing?
I think that's why it's important to stay connected as much as I do and as much as Doug does to our community. So when we stand up in the House of Commons and debate pieces of legislation, we know what we're talking about and that we're representing the voices of the people that we represent. There's not a day that goes by, Arif, that I'm not walking somebody or my staff are not walking somebody in off the ledge. I mean, the housing affordability and housing attainability crisis right now is not a figment of anybody's imagination. It's a real one. There are moms, single moms, families that are worried about keeping a roof over their head, worrying about the cost of groceries that have inflated. And I'm hearing from them every day. I have people call me who are crying on their phone because they don't know how they're going to get by, or they're worried about putting food on the table. I mean, we're a G7 country. We shouldn't be in this position, and it's not just happening here. It's right across the country where this affordability crisis is really having an impact on people. And so, listening, talking, raising the voice, providing alternative solutions, which is something that I try to do every time I stand up in the House of Commons to the government about what needs to be done in order to fix many of the problems that exist today. And many of them, as you say, or you implied, are self-inflicted wounds, either through economic policy. I know the carbon tax, for example, is having huge, huge impact on the affordability crisis for people. And it's not just at the consumer level, it's all the way through the supply chain as well.
So if you were to look at the textbook description of what your role is and compare it to what you're doing on a daily basis, how would it line up?
Well, I hope it lines up in the same way. What's my role? My role is to represent to advocate, to work on behalf of the people that I represent, and that includes both the councils in Barrie and in Innisfil and the businesses as well. Because the businesses are the ones that employ the people, and when people are impacted in a way in which I described earlier, through an affordability crisis, a housing crisis, all of the things that are going on right now, my job is to advocate and to provide solutions, and that's really what I try to do. It's a lot different when you're in government because, as I said earlier, you hold the levers of power, but in opposition, your job is not just to oppose, but also to provide solutions. And that's what I try to do every time I stand up in the House of Commons.
So one of the things that I'm hearing you talk about, and I sort of cast this out there, threw it out there regarding whether it's COVID and whether it's the economic impact of fiscal decision and Bank of Canada governance and interest rate governance decision making that was made as a result of COVID, but is it a result of COVID or is it a result of actions that were taken in response to COVID, et cetera? And it can go on, and it appears like just when we thought things might be calming down, we do have an election that's been called south of the border, and that's finalized south of the border, and that's now just in its infancy south of the border, and a lot of concern, a lot of consternation, a lot of jockeying for position, whether it was those who live south of the border, what decision were they going to make, who were they going to choose, were they going to choose the status quo, were they going to choose change, but then also the impact of those here north of the border who are offering their opinions and maybe adding either fuel to the fire or adding a level of leadership as to what the relationship would look like post-U.S. election. Here we are today. We have a new president, or a return of an old president in power. Where does Canada sit in terms of relationship there, federally, politically, but more importantly, how does it impact people locally here?
Yeah, and that's a great question. That's the million-dollar question at this point. We were never going to have a say on who the Americans were going to elect as a president. And obviously they chose Donald Trump as their president, and that's their decision to make. Where we needed to be is in preparation of a potential Trump election. To say I'm worried for local businesses and the families that they employ is an understatement as it relates to the threats of tariffs, because right now we've got a government that's prorogued, a leader who is in effect not leading. Prime Minister Trudeau has announced that he's resigning. They're going through a leadership race right now. I don't know what's going to come of it, who's going to become the leader, but we've got a government right now that's in dysfunction and chaos, and we've got a parliament that's been prorogued. So we've got no oversight, we've got no accountability, and we've got no transparency within the government. So at a time when we face these great threats, it's a real problem for this country not having a functioning government or a functioning parliament on how to address the threats that are here. And so, and there's been a lot of posturing, as you say. I mean, the provincial premiers have been going about their business, trying to defend their interests, whether it's Premier Smith in Alberta or Premier Ford here in Ontario. But the one thing that people have to remember is that provincial premiers don't have the constitutional authority to deal with issues that are of concern to the Americans right now, in particular President Trump, as it relates to border issues, drug issues, crime issues, defense issues, and other issues. That is the sole responsibility of the federal government. And so as the premiers are jockeying and trying to defend their positions, we have a lack of leadership at the federal level. And it's important for this country because it's the federal government that has the constitutional authority to deal with these issues, and they can deal with these issues. So my concern right now, frankly, is for the businesses and the people who are impacted, because the one thing that, politicians will not be impacted by this. They're not going to lose any money, right? They're still going to collect their salaries. But the people who are employed, the people who are worried about, as I said earlier, about keeping a roof over their head or putting food on their table, and the businesses that are going to be impacted by these tariffs, those are the ones that I'm extremely concerned about right now.
I'm going to ask you this question, and it might be a little bit charged in all fairness. To date, has there been a level of comfort or apathy with regard to Canadians' relationship to their American neighbors to the south? Have we sort of come to expect that things were going to be a certain way, and now that's being upset, that's being tested and challenged?
There's a couple of things to that. Number one, the United States is Canada's largest trading partner, and so we've relied on the Americans for many things, and that trade relationship of north-south, the dependence on that trade relationship has put us in a bad spot right now of dependence on the Americans, okay, whether it relates to natural resources or other things. Look, that relationship with the Americans has gone on for 157 years, as long as the existence of this country. We have fought wars with the Americans. We have businesses that are interconnected. We have a supply chain that is dependent on each other. We have family members that are Americans. We know, I think you have family members that live in the United States that I'm aware of. So that interdependence and that coexistence has always been one of peace and harmony and good business as well. And the longest undefended border in the world is another aspect of that relationship. And so, the Americans have as much to lose in a trade war as Canada does. And so we have to be mindful of that. We're prorogued right now. And, I'm of the opinion right now, Arif, that every single member of Parliament should be on a full frontal assault in Washington, working on those relationships that we have with Republican congressmen and women, senators, just to explain that relationship and how critical it is, and to try to, in some way, get them to convince President Trump that Canada is not a threat. Canada is not an enemy. Canada is a friend who have defended, those similar values that we've had throughout our coexistence and our history, and we need to, diplomacy needs to be the part of the solution to these threats that Canada is facing right now, and the Americans are facing, frankly, as well, because we've got a lot of businesses that supply a lot of goods to the Americans, and we have to be mindful of that. And the Americans more so need to be mindful of this relationship and just how important it is.
I'm hearing a takeaway of the importance of level setting and allowing that posturing to sort of die down and have a constructive conversation. And when we come back from this break, I think I want to pick this conversation up from where we left off. So stay with us for more from John Brassard right after this break. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move. Having a phenomenal conversation with John Brassard, Member of Parliament for Barrie South in Innisfil, and we're talking about really that dynamic locally and relationship between the federal, your role in federal government as well as, actually federal opposition, I should say, to be a little bit more exact, but also the relationship that we as Canadians have with our neighbors to the south and the impact that it has here locally. I want to get into that momentarily. You touched on a number of things. One, the idea that Canadian, representatives en masse should be in Ottawa.
We should be
advocating. And I'm just going to throw this out there again. Just destroy what I'm going to say. If you disagree with it, I'm completely fine with that. President Trump got elected based on a platform or based on a campaign that he ran that clearly must have resonated with enough people to end up with the result that we have. Like it, hate it is really irrelevant. He did win on his campaign.
Not in our control.
Not in our control. The fact is, now that he's there, he's delivering, or he's making an attempt to deliver on those promises. And one of the things he said, it was going to be immediate, it was going to be swift, it was going to be impactful. And here we are as neighbors. And you said something, though, that kind of resonated with me, which was the fact that Americans are going to feel the impact similar to the way Canadians are, and it's not productive. and on a similar scale. And that scale to me was really interesting because we sit as a population at about 1/10 of that of the United States. Tell me why you think it's going to have a similar impact on our U.S. neighbors.
Well, because we're so fully integrated throughout the supply chain, whether it's the auto sector or any manufacturing that we do in Canada that is sent down to the United States. We've got natural resources that are part of that as well. So, you know, the Americans will feel the impact. And look, in my view, we have to retaliate. We have to be very specific in where we retaliate. We have to minimize the impact of those tariffs, the retaliatory tariffs on Canadians, but maximize them on the Americans. And there are certain things that we can do in order to maximize the impacts. Trump was elected for several reasons. Number one, immigration issues. Perceived or real, there are immigration issues in the United States that he was elected with. The impact of crime as it relates to drugs, which speaks specifically to Canada and border control. Immigration in some way deals with Canada, because right now we've got 500,000 people, if you see the IRCC immigration numbers, that are in this country illegally, and the Americans see them, Trump specifically and his administration, as a threat to the United States. So we have to deal with that issue. Military defense, the defense of the United States, the defense of NATO as well. Canada has made a commitment of 2% of our GDP to expanding and building our military capability in alliance with NATO's demands, but we haven't lived up to that, right? So there are certain things from that standpoint that we can do in order to meet the demands of not just President Trump, but also our alliances as well. And so, you know, what do we need to do? As I said earlier, we need to be very specific and pinpoint the tariffs. You know, the other thing that we can do is make ourselves a little more economically competitive and less dependent on the United States, for example. You know, working on a better tax regime. If tariffs are going to be imposed, then we have to lower taxes to make ourselves much more competitive, to spur on investment. The consumer carbon tax has to go. The Americans don't have that. We have that. But more importantly, what we need to do, in addition to taxes and pinpointing retaliatory tariffs, is to really open ourselves up and diversify our resource sector. Arif, we've been dependent on north-south. We sell oil to the United States at a discount and buy it back as a premium to supply our nation. We've got either with LNG or oil, the top 5 reserves in the world. We can supply the world with clean Canadian energy. You know, it's been said that because of government, and I've seen figures lately where the government has impacted resource development in this country to a point where we've lost almost $200 billion in revenue over the last 9 years. This is LNG and gas and oil that we could have been sending around the world, supplying the world with clean Canadian energy. $200 billion that has been lost as a result of regulation and legislation of this current government. Think of what we could do with that $200 billion.
Just for perspective, there were countries in the EU and other parts of the world who were literally calling for these resources due to the war in the Ukraine or skyrocketing, you know, Saudi prices, et cetera.
Arif, I'm the chair of the Canada-Czech Parliamentary Friendship Group, so I deal with not just the Czech ambassador, but European Union ambassadors. Their number one purpose right now is to source other forms of energy so that they become less dependent on Russian natural resources, less dependent on Middle Eastern resources, Venezuelan resources. The German chancellor came here on bended knee asking for LNG from Canada, okay, with the best environmental standards, best labor standards, best human rights standards in the world, best innovation in the world, and our Prime Minister turned him away, and 2 weeks later he signed a deal with Qatar for $27 billion of LNG, okay? What could we have done with that money? And Qatar hasn't got those same standards, nor does Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and others. Why are we giving that money to despot dictators like Putin when we should be having that money come back here. Think of what we could do with $27 billion or $200 billion.
Well, I was going to say, let's not just throw out some of those numbers. Let's talk about what we could do with it. I mean, there are a lot of challenges, areas that we haven't had the funds to address. People are talking about the military veterans. They're talking about seniors. They're talking about hospitals and housing. And I just want to put a little context on that. Those aren't hypothetical numbers of what we could have made. You've actually provided some actual lost opportunities.
Let's think of it in the context of the tariff threats that we're facing right now. I mean, we had $200 billion of revenue as a result of our natural resource sector that we were supplying to the rest of the world, clean Canadian energy. How much of a threat would these tariffs be if we had $200 billion in our hip pocket? How much would we be able to help people, to your point earlier, in terms of investing in healthcare, investing in education, looking after people who are the most vulnerable in our society? Canada's natural resources, with all of those standards that I said earlier, can supply the world with clean Canadian energy at a time when the world needs it. And when I talk to these ambassadors and I talk to others, and when I talk about energy, I talk about mineral resources as well. For example, uranium and the application of uranium as it relates to small nuclear modular reactors to power electricity. They all tell me the same thing. They don't want to buy from Putin. They don't want to buy from Iran or Qatar or Venezuela. They want to buy from like-minded countries like Canada, who has the rule of law, who has trade dispute mechanisms in place, who has a court system that is similar to theirs. Why not Canada supplying the world with this energy? And why can't we get that billions and billions of dollars in revenue back so that we can look after the things that are important to our nation, including the threats that come as a result of Donald Trump being elected?
I'm going to throw this word out there, John, and it's probably a wedge issue, but the word that comes to mind is ideology.
We have, in the last 9.5 years, seen an ideological activist attack on our energy sector. And I can cite pieces of legislation, Bill C-69, which is the anti-pipeline bill that was implemented by this government, and there are others as well, that have been designed to not utilize our natural resources in a way that it should be, and that is to supply clean Canadian energy around the world, but more so to create the economic prosperity in this country that has been lacking over the last 9.5 years. Think of what we can do with $200 billion of revenue that's been lost. We, and I know, look, we oftentimes people talk about climate change. One of the best ways that we can solve climate change in the world, or at least help mitigate the impact of climate change, is to supply the world with clean Canadian energy. Because every time we're not doing that, every time we're not sending oil or natural gas to another nation, it means that other nation, like Qatar and Iran and China and others, without the environmental standards that we have, we're displacing that to those nations. And so I say, why not Canada in terms of wealth? And the thing we need to do in this country is have the ambition and the audacity to build the infrastructure required to get our natural resources to market. We've often talked about a natural energy corridor where we bring resources from Alberta and Saskatchewan east for refining, and so that we can ship it to other countries around the world. But that economic and energy corridor can go both ways. We can supply Quebec energy and electricity to the other parts of Canada where it's needed as well. And so we have a tremendous opportunity, but it's going to take, a lack of will on the part of Canada. We need to deal with this as as an emergency right now, right? So that we're not dependent north-south, so that we can diversify our economy around the world in large part because of the energy that we can supply.
So we are going to get this somehow back to local, but it really is local. It does impact everything local, as you talked about housing and healthcare and education and veteran services, et cetera. And each one of those items does impact each individual household here locally. But you know, I sort of poked you with that comment or that question around the word ideology, but it's not just localized. We see the executives at Stellantis have made a decision to reverse, their reverse course or stall their course on pursuing fully EV pickup trucks through the Ram product.
Happened
at Toyota.
All over the place now.
Toyota as well out of Japan. The executives there have decided that they're going to go back to the hybrid mix because they don't see a future in fully EV, or that it's not there yet, et cetera. So I don't know that it's just a conversation happening here. When we come back from the break, though, what I do want to talk to you about is the fact that while you have identified that these federal matters and the matters around border security and the matters around this trade is really a federal matter, we've got provinces that are bordering. We've got municipalities that are bordering U.S. neighbors. And obviously those mayors and provincial elected officials have decided to, take a stand on that. So when we come back, I want to talk to you about, what's happening on a more local level and how is that influencing decisions at a federal level. So stay with us, just teeing you up for that, but stay with us on the other side of this break. We'll be back with more from John Brassard. Welcome back to Barrie City on the Move, and I'm having a conversation with John Brassard that if I'm learning one thing, as much as we want to talk about local and the relationship and the dynamic with our provincial and in this case federal members of parliament and opposition in this particular case, I'm learning that not everything happens in a bubble, that there are ramifications and implications that go beyond the city of Barrie's borders, that go provincially and nationally and of course internationally. And before the break, we were talking about sort of these measures that we're now anticipating or discussing or posturing or sizing up and strategizing around how do we respond to President Trump's threat of tariffs. And I left you with sort of a question of, while we're waiting on the federal government to one, come back and be a fully functioning government, but two, to respond officially with an official position. In the meantime, premiers have been coming together and collaborating, and members of local municipalities that have border issues and border constraints and concerns, they're obviously not just sort of waiting around to figure out. And I'll even go one step further, John. We heard in the last year and change, perhaps 2 years, obviously during inflation, Canadians were really angry and upset about the cost of groceries, and the words that came out were shrinkflation and greedflation and words like that. And Canadians didn't wait around for the federal government to make a decision. They decided to do exactly what you said, which was a full frontal assault on the opposition, and that was to take on the grocery giants and say enough is enough, we're going to boycott. Right now there is a grassroots movement towards reading the label, and if it says made in America, we're not going to wait for these tariffs and counter tariffs and retaliation to come federally. We're going to do something as Canadians. Are you hearing about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, not so much that as I've been talking to a lot of local businesses lately, trying to gauge what the impact of the Trump tariffs would have, or the potential of the tariffs would have. And the reverse is true, actually. And this surprised me when I talked to one of our large local manufacturers here in terms of the stigma, as they called it, of Buy America, right? Right now, the Americans have kind of turned inward and are focused on buying America more than they are buying outside of America. And that's concerning because, as she said to me, the business owner said to me, I can deal with the tariffs. Is it going to have an impact on my business? Absolutely. And could it potentially impact my employees and their families? Absolutely it could, but one of the things that she's struggling with right now is the stigma, and I've heard from other businesses that it's America first. And so if it has a Made in Canada label, for example, that is undermining their ability to market into the United States, particularly if there's competition or some competitive business that the Americans can buy that from. So I've heard what you've heard about, buying in Canada, and look, at the end of the day, we need to support our local economy. We all talk about buy local, shop local, right? Like, anything we can do to help support not just our local economy here in Barrie, but provincially and federally. That should be a priority of all Canadians, frankly. But the reverse is true on this stigma aspect of Americans buying American and the impact that that's going to have on Canadian businesses as well.
Now, and what are some of the concerns that you have heard? I mean, you mentioned impact on the employees and impact on the households. I mean, this is a localized matter. Barrie and area certainly has a heavy presence in automotive manufacturing, supplying the automotive industry with parts, automation in general, CNC shops, et cetera. There is the potential, and what are you hearing about concerns around the ability to continue to function? Are we going to be able to keep these employees on, et cetera? What are you hearing in that regard?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the ancillary effect that an impact on one business has. I call it the cascading effect because there's a lot of things that are fully integrated throughout the supply chain. And when we talk about Barrie, I think we need to talk about regionally as well, because obviously we've got the Honda plant, we've got Napoleon and Oro Medante and others. We've got some pretty significant businesses in Barrie who are dependent on the Americans as well. And I think I mentioned it earlier, the concern that I have is not necessarily for the politicians, of which I'm one, because politicians generally don't lose in these circumstances. It's the people that they represent who lose, right? So I'm concerned about the impact that this is going to have on our businesses and the people that they employ, those families who are already worried about keeping a roof over their head. There's 1 million mortgages in this country. You mentioned earlier that were bought during COVID at low interest rates that are up for renewal at interest rates around 5%. So that's going to have a significant increase in the requirement to pay a mortgage. There's 1 million of them across this country, and I don't know the numbers locally, but I suspect, proportionally, it's a good number. That are up for renewal, and so
it's about 80%.
Well, you know better than I in that case, and so I've learned something today as well. But I'm worried about families who are facing those mortgage renewals, who are increasingly facing the cost of goods and services, whether it's at the grocery store or in other places, because again, the supply chain is fully integrated. This cascading effect of overregulation and overtaxation on businesses is having an impact throughout the entire supply chain, and I would include the consumer carbon tax in that. I kind of find it funny now that the government, through their leadership race that's going on right now, and those that are running, those who implemented the consumer and were its staunchest defenders, are now backing away from it, even though we were calling for a removal of the carbon tax years ago, because we knew and we were hearing from our residents and our businesses just how much of an impact that was having on them. So, as I said earlier, to say I'm worried is an understatement for the families that I represent in the businesses as well.
We found ourselves a little bit caught off guard. I'm going to say that's an understatement right there. Off guard in terms of being ill-prepared for what happened during COVID. There were 1 in 3 businesses that were suffering where they either folded completely or they had to reinvent themselves, but there was a lot of challenge there. We also witnessed the era of high-speed internet, just sort of really decided there was a will, there was a way, and they got themselves up to speed, and we were able to see businesses start to perform in an online fashion. One of the things that I noticed is that there was a bit of a culture shift or just a shift in general, where business owners realized, I don't just have to find myself constrained with dealing locally, I now have the ability to deal globally. Is there, you talk about sort of a change in terms of that north-south relationship and opening our eyes to other relationships with other parts of the world. Do you see Barrie businesses, Barrie and surrounding regional, Simcoe County regional businesses being able to find a way to compete similarly outside of that north-south relationship?
I think they're trying their best. They're put in a difficult position right now. Look, I mean, the job of government is to support businesses, not necessarily economically, but to create an environment, either through less legislation, less regulation, where businesses can thrive. I've always said, coming out of COVID, that it's going to be our businesses, the people that they employ and the products and services that they produce, that are going to make them competitive, not just domestically here at home, but around the world, right? And that includes government getting out of the way through less regulation and less legislation. It doesn't just impact, any decision that we make in government doesn't just impact the natural resource sector in a negative way. It affects all businesses, whether it's taxation or otherwise. So, one of the things, if we do form government, the measure of our success will be based on two things. Number one, and that is that we're going to be in government, not to run people's lives, but to run a government. And secondly, if we can make decisions that positively impact a few things, if we make a few good decisions as opposed to making all wrong decisions, then I think that will be a good measure of any future government. And that's one of the things that we're focused on. We need to make sure that our local businesses are competitive, that they're able to compete here at home and around the world, and that includes a tax regime that makes them competitive and a government that is there to support them in any way that we can, not to be a barrier to business. And I say this every time a business opens in the city. Our job as government is not to stand in front of business and become a barrier either through regulation or legislation. Our job is to stand behind business and let them do their thing, let them innovate, let them grow, let them expand, let them hire, all of the things that government can create an environment to be successful in.
I'm going to dive into a bit of a speed round with you because we've got mere moments left.
Go.
A decision was made south of the border that is essentially a cultural shift in business and economic policy, et cetera, ideological policy as well. You mentioned earlier, well, by the time we're actually airing the show, that there will be an election called provincially here, and you're also anticipating an election coming up federally. Did the Canadian government let its inside voice out? Office of the Prime Minister let its inside voice out in terms of who they thought should be leading south of the border, and did that have an impact on the relationship that we have today?
Well, I'll answer it this way quickly. You don't bash a former president thinking that he's not going to get reelected and then expect a different result than what we're seeing right now. And they spent the better part of 4 years expending a lot of capital bashing the former president, and unfortunately, I think we're going to be paying the price for that. So, they didn't expect him to get reelected, and he did. Maybe just mind your own business. Stop worrying about what's happening down south and start focusing on what's happening in our country. That should be the job of any government, not to intervene in people's lives, businesses or individuals, but to be a government, and that's what we're going to be focused on soon.
Now, across the country, we are going to be going into a federal election, and I imagine you're putting your name in the ring, throwing your hat in as well.
Yep.
Your leader, the leader of the party, Mr. Poilievre, obviously has attracted those who are fans and those who are detractors to his message and his platform. There are those who think he doesn't have one, and there are those who think he's a little bit kind of akin to the next door neighbor. What's your message? 30 seconds.
30 seconds, I would say we're not electing somebody to be your friend, we're electing somebody to be your prime minister and to lead this country unlike what we have now. We have no leadership in this country, with new, fresh ideas that are going to restore the hope and promise of Canada. Obviously, we've talked about axing the tax, building homes, fixing the budget, and stopping crime that is pervading our streets. That's going to be our focus, and if we do a few things right, if Pierre does a few things right, right, not everything wrong. That'll be a good measure of success for our government.
MP John Brassard, I wish you well, and
Thanks.
thank you very much for giving me your time on Barrie City on the Move, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining.